welcome everyone. So, happy Easter, happy April 20th, happy hopefully nothing too bad happens today. And then happy, wait, do we actually know when the, traditional celebration of, you know, the festival, it would have been connected with the Marseillais feast, right?
For the resurrection?
Yeah.
See, I'm not particularly certain when the resurrection of Baal was actually celebrated. I would assume it would probably have been celebrated sometime around the autumn because the resurrection, maybe in the spring. It's all these festivals from the Canaanite tradition are related to seasonal, agricultural cycles, and you plant the crops in the autumn and then they grow up in the spring. So it almost certainly would have happened sometime in the early spring. They had a festival.
Dude, I think I might have just found your doppelganger.
Jack Black?
Not quite. Look at this. I typed in Baal and Jesus, and the first thing that comes up, at first I thought this guy was you.
Show me.
I am.
That guy's supposed to be me?
You gotta admit, a little bit.
Yeah, right. I can see that.
But yeah, low-key, that video does sound interesting. But there was one that... Oh, okay, wait. Is it... Have you ever heard of... I think I might have sent you her channel before, but Rihanna Coltastic?
No. I don't remember a lot of...
The reason why I'm mentioning is because right up the alley.
I just came to the realization that Jesus is Lord means Jesus is Baal. Baal means Lord. So when people say Jesus is Lord, they're saying Jesus is Baal. Two dying and rising gods from Canaan. Ugh. The irony is not lost on me. Jesus is Baal.
The laughing kind of creeps me out, but
Yeah, I see what you're talking about.
And I thought he had plenty of hair.
Huh? Oh. Also, it's kind of interesting, just before I forget about it. So, you know how you have Elijah and then you have Elisha?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
So, a lot of people don't really talk about this, but, Elisha wasn't just some guy who was second to Elijah. You know that, right?
I think he was had a 10 times the portion of the spirit of Elijah or something like that.
Oh, interesting. I didn't even think about that, but no, that's not what I'm talking about.
But what are you talking
about? Wasn't he the angry bald guy?
Yes, he was the angry bald guy who sent the bears to attack the kids.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Check this out.
People make fun of that, but if you lived in Morocco, you'd understand.
So in Ugarit, there was a god named Elish. Elish was a minor god regarded as the herald of the house of Baal. That's kind of, the whole idea of Eliyahu, Elijah being a herald of, Yud-Hey, Vav-Hey. And then here it's almost taking it. So it makes you wonder, is there any connection here, or is this just a parallel, is it just a coincidence? But he was believed to have multiple wives. Interesting. Referred to as the herald goddesses. Okay, this is interesting. Nagart, Ilit. The word nagar, it can mean herald. It can also mean carpenter. Whoa! Are you thinking what I'm thinking now?
What are you thinking?
Well, think about it. If the word for carpenter is connected with the word for herald, and then there's this whole motif of, given, I think that, there's multiple ways you could view, the motifs within the story of Jesus, but at least the whole idea of him, walking on the water, of which kind of parallels the whole idea of Rabat Atirat Yam, the lady who treads upon the sea. And you also have when he says, like, no one comes to the Father but through me. But the thing is that, okay, if that's part of the reason why the whole Trinity gets created or understood, because he's saying no one can come to the Father but through me, but apparently he's also God. And at least the context I've always seen in is that he's speaking for a God. But the thing is, if he's speaking for God the Father, why would he say no one can come to the Father but through me if he's, speaking as the Father? Like, almost like, it's like one of those sci-fi movies where you have someone like, and then all of a sudden they just like, actually, I don't know what I mean. Not about. But it would basically be like someone's holding a speaker, and then the voice comes through that speaker, but the person who's holding it, they're not the one like who you should be focusing on. And so within that context, I think that the idea of no one comes to El, the Father, but through me, it's referring to Asherah, because if you follow the Ugaritic Baal Cycle, they when both him and his sister, who threatens violence, when they can't convince El to allow them to build a temple on Mount Safon, they end up going to their mom.
Yep.
Yeah. So.
Well, I mean, it's also interesting you talk about heralds and not going to the Father for you, but the Ugaritic Baal myth has this often neglected side of the story of herald gods called Sukals, who are subordinate to chief gods, major gods like Baal or El, each have their own Sukal. For example, the Sukal of Asherah is Hadish wa Omarar, and the Sukals of Baal are Gapin and Ugar. They're subordinate herald gods who deliver messages on their behalf. And I imagine that it's also, you declare, if your message declares to that guy's messenger to communicate that you don't actually speak directly. And that's part of the theology itself, that Jesus can be a Sukal, can be seen as like a Sukal of the Israelite God, perhaps.
I was going to say, from everything you said there, I would say you just about sold me, and I'd have to look into it more, that there's a connection between, Ugarit, Elish, and Elisha in the Bible, because that would also make sense, since it would parallel the Ugarit Daniel and Daniel in the Bible. Makes a lot of sense to me, Tag.
Interesting.
Certainly, the name Daniel is one of those names in, that I think the Bible was referring to positively in many different places, because it was contextually positive in its associations in a wider Near Eastern context. I think also much the same with Melchizedek. They had to include Melchizedek to figure into the story, and they couldn't condemn him, even though he's a rival priesthood compared to the priesthood that they are associating with, the Levitical priesthood, because, like Jesus, he has this positive association today, even outside of Christianity, presumably in that Near Eastern context when the Bible was being written, the mythological figure of the righteous king, or Daniel, is very, 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 very prevalent. And no one could shit talk him, even though he's a pagan. They have to praise him and reinvent him.
Yeah, no, that's what I noticed in the story of Daniel versus Daniel in the Bible, where it's very much the old Ugaritic story is basically rehabilitated and, given a fresh coat of paint and reworked for the new context. And it seems like a lot of what ended up becoming the Jewish religion several, more than a millennia later, was started as Ugaritic mythology and traditions. That's what I'm noticing. Tag.
Let's get on with the topic at hand, because we're talking, today's obviously the Christian festival of Easter, and to be topical, we have to make our video about resurrection, because obviously Jesus wasn't the first Near Eastern or Canaanite god to rise from the dead and bring back salvation of some variety.
Yeah. So I think this might be a good way of getting started, because there's a lot of people like, oh, I hear people saying that Jesus is like Baal, and then they try to debunk it. And the thing is, I think people miss is that even if it's like these people say like, oh, Jesus is Baal. No, Jesus isn't literally Baal in the same way that trying to think of an example. I don't have a good example, but like it's like comic book characters. You can have a comic book character from DC and you could have one from Marvel. They might be based off of each other. You might have this like interplay. One might have come before the other, but to say that there's no connection, you've got to be blind.
Well, obviously there is a precedent of the title of Baal being passed down to different deities.
Okay, fair. But I mean more so an idea that Jesus isn't literally Hadad.
I was going to say a good analogy for that is the way the Romans had a lot of gods that were based off of the Greeks. It's like Minerva is not actually Athena, even though there's a lot of overlap. Okay.
Though in that case, there is thoughts that that Minerva was based off of an indigenous Etruscan goddess.
I was going to say the same thing, actually. But
they took the Etruscan goddess and then merged in a lot of the Greek aspects of Athena, and it became something other than Athena, sort of thing. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. All right. So let's get on with this, and I want to hear our comments. All in Jesus.
One pagan parallel to the resurrection of Jesus would be the story of Baal coming back to life. We hear about Baal in the Old Testament. Well, Baal was this god, and he had a brother named Mot, and they were at each other. They didn't like each other. And one day, Mot was taunting his brother Baal, and Baal was the storm god. He had lightning, he had wind, tornadoes, hurricanes, things like this, whereas Mot was the god of the underworld. So Mot is taunting Baal and says, why don't you leave heaven and come on down, give up your storms, and I'll show you who's your daddy. So Baal comes down and meets Mot in the underworld, and Mot swallows him. Well,
is it just okay? Actually, no. Technically, that part is right, but I get the sense that this guy's only read the Baal Cycle once.
I also think that he's being very. I don't like his interpretation of the text particularly well. It's kind of dismissive.
Yeah, I see that.
I think I can see what he's getting at, but it's kind of like needlessly reductive.
You give him more credit than me. I'm not sure he's actually read the Baal Cycle rather than just some synopsis of it.
I think he probably just read some apologetics synopsis, and then, like with the game of telephone, you reduce some of the most meaningful elements and highlight the most humorous elements. The pop history version.
Yeah.
As long as he knows enough in order to justify his Christianity, that's all that matters.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how do we know this? Later on, we find
his
parents talk.
I was going to say, it's like, wait, what is this? He's just trying to say, oh, this is just Canaanite, Canaanable. Like one kills the other.
And they figured that Baal is dead because it's no longer raining.
Oh, and that actually makes me think this idea of, they think Baal is dead, but then, and again, it's possible that I'm just reading it into this way because of the way he's phrasing it, but the story of Joseph, how his brothers, they tell Jacob that their father, that they're, dude, how did I not see this before? The story of Joseph supposedly being mauled by a wild animal, that's very similar to the story of Eshmun.
That is Eshmun or Adon?
Both.
Adon is the one who's mauled by the boar, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but no, Eshmun as well. Because the thing, from what I've heard, Eshmun and Adonis, they're essentially the same. It's just Adonis is a Hellenized version. because like you did have Eshmunadon, like where the Bizadon is the title, but specifically this whole idea of he found the gaze of Astarte and she was in love with him, and then either because he didn't want to be with her or because of like some wild boar or another wild animal, he was killed, and so she raised him up to be what we now know is the constellation. Oh my god, I'm blanking. The Ophiuchus. The serpent bearer.
So interestingly, the version of the story that I heard was he died because he castrated himself because he was running away from the affections of Ashtart, and she felt bad, and that's why she resurrected him. But
yeah, there's multiple versions.
What occurs to me is, does that tie into again? This is another one of the Canaanite or Mesopotamian Easter parallels. Is Dumuzid, Tammuz Dumuzid.
Exactly. Yeah. Dumuzid is just the Mesopotamian equivalent of Eshmun Adonis, who, or there was one who was to be seduced by Ishtar, and he kind of realizes that all of the lovers of Ishtar tend to meet with negative fates, so he spurns her, and then he ends up dead because of that, which is another parallel also to the goddess Anat in the Epic of Karat, the Epic of Akkad, where Anat promises a lot of fancy things, including immortality itself, in exchange for the bow, but instead Akkad said, "No, this bow is just for men. You're supposed to go back to the kitchen and make me a sandwich, bitch," basically.
Oof, he should not have done that.
He should not have done that. But she didn't want to kill him, actually. She didn't intentionally kill him. She sent her henchmen to steal the bow from him. And in the event of the thieving of the bow, he was killed and the bow was lost. Which is interesting because
the bow is made by Kothar, right?
Yeah, it's made by Kothar Wakasis. It's a magical bow. And then it falls into the sea, which implies that this powerful magical weapon goes to Prince Yam. At least that's what I went with.
Interesting. I can see that. I definitely see that.
I would say that it's chronologically before the Baal epic, actually, in terms of its place in it. That's how I take it.
Yeah, I wish we had so much more myth, preserved than we do.
Yeah, no, I see Dumuzid tying in more directly with Jesus and the resurrection via Dumuzid being a cognate for David and Jesus in the house of David, with the idea of the tradition of Jesus in the the rising and dying tradition.
Yeah, it is interesting. Like this, one of the first songs I remember learning. I mean, I don't even remember learning. That's how early I learned it. David Melech Yisrael Chai Chai V'Kayom, and it means David, King of Israel, Chai, he's alive, Chai V'Kayom, alive and still exists, or like still stands, and it's like, how is someone who's dead still alive? And on one hand, it's like, okay, well, it's referring to the house of David, but like, it's also a much older motif of this idea of he's dead, but he's not dead, or he's dead, but he's coming back.
Well, because the king is dead, long live the king.
There's this notion that Baal's victory over Mot, the god of death, isn't as much like a personal resurrection, although it is also that, but it's a symbolic resurrection through the power of lineage, through the power of descent. Because what is the act that he does before he's killed by Mot?
He plants a few seeds.
Yes, he copulates. And this means that you don't need to fear death because the legacy lives on through the lineage. This Near Eastern symbolism of generations, which are so thematic to Canaanite religion and to the Baal cycle, because it's the Baal cycle because it's a cycle. There's a cycle of Baals throughout history with the Baal spirits. That's the idea.
So basically, is it like in the Canaanite version rather than like in Christianity? It's like, okay, Baal has a son, and then the next year Baal's son is going to be the one who dies, and then leaves a new Baal.
Yeah. So So each time there's a Baal, he gets reborn, just as when the seeds get harvested and when the crops, die. You plant the seed, the new seeds get planted, and then you get the new crop for the next year.
Interesting, and that could have been one of the reasons that he was seen as the son of Dagon, the son of the grain god.
And that's the true immortality of Baal that makes him immortal in a way that the other gods, who are not technically mortal in the same way Baal is, he's immortal because he represents the cycle of life, death, and rebirth.
Fascinating. All right, let's.
So Baal's mother goes down to Mott and said, "What have you done to your brother?" "Well, I swallowed him." "Well, you need to."
It wasn't his mother; it was Anat, right?
I think it was Anat and Shapash, the goddess of the sun.
"Vomit him." "I won't do it." "Yes, you will." "No, I won't." And so she beats up Mott, and he agrees to vomit Baal, but she has to leave first. So she leaves, and then later on, Baal's dad says, "Well, Baal is alive again." How did they know this? Because it was raining again. Now, this would be a story that was told in antiquity in order to explain to children why there were seasonal changes, why there was rain for the different agricultural cycles, and why there was dryness. It'd be kind of the same as we have today when you're a child and child asks, "Well, what's thunder?" And they say, "Well, it's the angels bowling in heaven," or "the angels are moving furniture in heaven." But these things had to do in antiquity with the agricultural cycles. Jesus' resurrection had nothing to do with the agricultural cycles. And in fact, Jesus' resurrection was proclaimed within just a few years of the event about a historical figure, whereas these other things about Baal and some of these other gods in the Near Eastern Mediterranean world who were said to come back to life, they were always tied to the agricultural cycles and were situated in the gray, distant, unnamed past.
I think you might have missed the point of the story.
I think so as well. And the other thing that I noticed is the dismissive attitude that he takes to pre-Christian religions, to pre-Abrahamic religions, is the same dismissive attitude that atheists take to all religions. They're criticizing atheists for being, too, disrespectful about their religion, but then they do the same thing about other religions. Like, oh, this is just an explanation of natural phenomena. But no, ours is not an explanation of natural phenomenon. It just may thematically relate to previous explanations of natural phenomenon, but it was totally real. Like, it was totally real. There were people who saw it even, and they wrote it in a book that I read.
So, was thinking now. Oh, wait, what is? Sorry, I'm very easily distracted. But, yeah, I mean, why do you think there's been such a demonization of the figure of Baal?
I think because the figure of Baal is an attack on the authority of divinity, the attack on absolute authority in many, many different respects. Much of the message of Baal is a liberating message. It's not one of obedience. It's one of interrogating the world, almost objectively. And it's one also of, the legitimacy of Baal is not traditionally assigned. It's not from his, divine patrimony. He's not the son of El. He's metaphorically the son of El, but he's actually a bastard son between the big evil god that came before, Shamuma, and a mortal woman. He's the divine bastard, basically.
I thought his father was Dagon.
Well, adopted father. if you read it in Sekuniathon, he's not the son of El, and El does not choose him. He doesn't have the virtue of being chosen by God to succeed. He doesn't have traditional legitimacy. His legitimacy is revolutionary legitimacy. He overthrows Yam not because Yam is the illegitimate god by traditional standards of legitimacy, by birth, by the choice of the previous leader, by all these traditionally established practices of legitimacy. Baal is deriving his legitimacy from morality specifically and from a revolutionary economic change to the status quo. Because we see that Yam's crime is making the gods labor and toil as slaves under his reign.
Wait, this Yam?
That's the sin.
Interesting, because that parallels the whole motif of the Exodus.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's no accident, I think, that Baal's biological son by the cow in the fields of Shechem is given the name Moshe, which is couldn't be any more transparent than that.
Where's this found? Because I've heard you mention it before, but I couldn't ever find the reference to it.
This is at least in the translation of the Baal epic that I have. It occurs around the place where he is killed. I would have to dig for the exact verse. It actually gets really terse around that point, around Baal's death, which is interesting because it goes from a passage where it's anything but terse, where it's Baal giving essentially a feast to all these minor unnamed deities, the chair gods, the throne goddesses, the cup gods, the chalice goddesses, just this absolutely unknown gods, which is also a redistribution of divine wealth along the blanket of all gods, not just the important ones.
Yeah, it's like out of Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah, kind of. It doesn't mean that they're actually chairs, but the idea is it's a flattening of the status. It goes from being a pyramid to being like a flat table. It's a very revolutionary principle. And this is why Christians and the Bible in general, Christians and Jews and the Bible in general are so adamant against Baal worship, because of Baal worship as opposed to other forms of Canaanite worship, because it was just one form of Canaanite worship manifesting out of the combination of cultures from the Hurrians and the Canaanites in the city of Ugarit through a very specific time and context is so revolutionary, is so unusually egalitarian for that time and subversive and therefore attractive to the working or like the lower classes, the ostracized classes.
Definitely. So this actually,
I was going to weigh in here real quick. I was going to say, I see two, there are a lot of reasons, but two of the biggest reasons I see Baal got demonized was the first one to split him off and differentiate him from Yahweh later on, because they very much started from a similar origin. And that was used to, basically the, if it's something that similar, you do an inversion. You make the other person's worship of a similar god like the worst thing in the world.
Here's another thing that I was thinking about with the defamation of Baal. What is the term, like the epithet on Baal in the Hebrew Bible that everyone knows?
Baal Zavul, the Lord of Flies.
Yeah. And what are flies also known for? Are mainly known for? They poetically, contextually.
Yeah. They are to feces what bees are to honey.
Yep. And
am I off base? I was going to say, when I think of Baal in the Bible, I think of Baal Hadad first.
I don't think Baal Hadad's ever actually used as an epithet for Baal in the Bible.
Well, I'm talking about the epithet. Baal is associated with flies, and poetically, flies are meant to symbolize the ephemeral, the temporary, the momentary sort of power. So Yahweh is supposed to represent the kingdom everlasting, but Baal is very much a momentary sort of symbolic power. He comes and he goes. And that's a lot with the symbolism of the story of Elijah. Is they're making fun of how Baal is dead. He's sleeping, you know. They say Baal Zebul because Baal is, or Baal Zebul or whatever, because his association with flies, because he is a mortal god. He is not immortal in the same way other gods traditionally are depicted.
Okay, the other big reason I see for the villain, the villainization of Baal is the connection with the Punic people, like Carthage, and their religion and approach to sacrifice and such, and how that was so anathema to Rome, which would have been where the villainization would have been coming in about the time Roman was tromping around Cana. That's another big connection I see for villainizing Baal. Tag.
Do you actually think that the vilification in the Old Testament of Baal and the story of Elijah and all that, and throughout the Book of Kings and the Deuteronomistic histories, etc., do you think that sort of only got formalized around the time of Roman contact with Judaism and Hellenistic contact with Judaism?
Personally, 100%. I did a presentation last fall where I see the construction, the finalization of the Torah was a Ptolemy and basically I would say Nabatean effort in like about 280 or so BC. And a lot of that was just for the Torah, the Septuagint. And a lot of the other books you're talking about, like Judges and all, that was like later on translation, reworking the stories into more of a Hellenistic format. You take the old input stories and you just rework it into a Hellenistic format, and that's what got added on later. So given that one, you're talking Rome started showing up there sometime around there. I also see the Maccabees and the Jewish wars as continuation of the Punic Wars with Carthage, where the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans were basically the veterans of the Punic Wars who gave up Carthage, came back to Tyre, and then retook the Canaan for their own kingdom.
Certainly,
Tag.
Certainly, I made a video the other day basically exploring the parallels between Roman anti-Punic sentiment and the development of anti-Semitism as an anti-Jewish further in ancient Rome. The rather anti-Semitic sentiment is against specifically all Semitic people and related to the Punic Wars and related, to this othering of Semitic people, Syrians, in the Roman Empire as being decadent barbarians with feminized characteristics.
Well, I was going to say, I think that's one of the few things that both the Carthaginians and the Romans agreed upon, is that they were others to each other. They, the Carthaginians saw Rome as an other that was only suitable for war and destruction. Same thing, Rome to Carthage.
Well, the irony, I think, is that they were originally allies. They were originally allies against Pyrrhus and against the Greek expansionism. But then later, I think they both kind of identified with the Greeks. Hannibal himself was a big Hellenophile and actually tried to bring Greek-style democracy to Carthage, which was this corrupt oligarchy before then.
Oh, no, it's one of those things that I notice is, Hannibal and his family seem to be out of step with the traditional Carthaginians, because the Carthaginians in general, they hated the fight. They did not want to get their hands dirty. They were merchants and they wanted to pay mercenaries to fight for them. And that's where Hannibal and his family were different. They were hands-on. They got in the middle of it. They took the elephants over the Alps. It's two different approaches. I have a lot of respect for Hannibal. People just want to pay money and then cut bait as soon as your mercenaries want more money. Yeah, that's decent strategy to me.
It was definitely a bad strategy to skip your mercenaries while they're still armed and right outside your city gates.
It's not like they were the first ones to make that mistake in, that long. Mistake had been made by rulers for thousands of years. Tag.
Yeah. Actually, it seems to be a mistake that kept getting replayed again and again in the 17th and 16th centuries in particular during the wars of religion, where different monarchs would, hire up these big mercenary armies, and then they realized, oh, we don't have any money to pay them with. So they would just go and raid and rape and kill and loot everything around. And that's why war just couldn't stop, because everyone hated everyone else because of this mercenary warfare.
Well, war was an every year seasonal activity, sort of like the football season.
Yeah.
You go out, you have your war, come back home, and go do it again next year.
Yeah, the best way to maintain control is make sure that the people who are doing all the suppression don't look or sound like you.
I think the interesting thing about talking about history is the war of religions in the 16th and 17th century strike me as like the first example of a modern day total war, which is motivated by ideology rather than just it being the sport. And then that kept replaying again and again and again with ruinous consequences for imperialism. But that's a completely different subject now. Well, I guess like cycles of war in history kind of relates to, death and resurrection. Let's keep on topic, I guess.
Yeah. So I did want to show this because this is also from Rion Cultastic, but this I thought it was interesting because I forget what it was you mentioned, but it maybe about how Baal I don't remember exactly, but I think the connection.
Do you love Jesus? If so, you should thank a woman the Bible demonized, because without Jezebel, there would be no Jesus. Jezebel's daughter Athaliah married into the line of David. Her son became king. That is Jezebel's grandson, and he carried on the Davidic line. Therefore, Jezebel's blood runs through the Messiah. But Jezebel, the Bible writers paint her as evil. They let dogs eat her body, even though there are patriarchs and kings who killed more people, committed more heinous acts that are considered righteous. But this is a pattern for the Bible. The Bible borrows from women and then erases them. It used Jezebel to build a kingdom. It stole from Asherah to build a god, but it won't give either of them credit. Funny how Bible writers villainize the very women that make their heroes possible.
It's interesting, like the political implications of Jezebel and her murder vis-a-vis maybe like a conspiracy of Yahweh's working to destroy Israel, because the way I read it is Jezebel's marriage to King Ahab and subsequent marriages.
Yeah, my take there is much like forcing things through an apologist filter for your interpretation. I think
exactly.
Forcing things through a feminist filter for your interpretation is also as toxic to me.
Yeah,
I'm egalitarian. I throw the stones at all sides.
Yeah, it does seem like he's forcing it too much through a feminist picture. The way I force it through is my geopolitical picture. Like these were political marriages built to create a coalition against the looming threat of the Assyrian Empire, one that threatened every kingdom in the Levant. And this conspiracy, a conspiracy led by the cult of Yahweh, killed Jezebel, killed her family, broke the ties between the kingdom of Tyre and the kingdom of Judah and kingdom of Israel, which was so important for creating a coalition against Assyria, and also helped depose the king of Aram Damascus and imposed a new king that he knew was going to invade Israel, that being Hazael. So it takes the form of a political conspiracy that actually politically undermines Israel and weakens Israel and Judah against Assyria and serves the needs of Assyria.
Interesting. I was going to say I'd have to look into more detail. I come from the standpoint of the unified and most of the divided kingdom history never actually happened. That there never was. It's like the destruction of Jerusalem didn't happen. There wasn't a second. Nebuchadnezzar didn't make a second trip back. He only made one trip. We can't find any record of that second trip anywhere except in the Bible. And I sort of like, it fits more that it's the idea that was, again, I'm using a rough theory, that the idea of the northern and southern kingdoms are kind of encoded histories between Assyria and Babylon, with Assyria being the northern kingdom and Babylon being the southern kingdom. And then it got, melded into some of the historical facts as well. You have like that one, and then you have some other stuff. It's again, I have an interesting theory that it's a work in progress.
I mean, my perspective as a historian is that I think it's basically unambiguously true that there were two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, but they weren't the kingdoms that were rhetorically presented in the Book of Kings. They did exist. There was a kingdom of Israel that is fully attested from Assyrian sources. They mention the submission of
the Amorites were definitely,
but it's obviously not. It's not Jewish. Neither of them were anything like Jewish. They were fully Canaanite kingdoms around the same areas that previous coalitions or previous hegemonic kingdoms existed already in the Amarna period. And this is probably just filling in a power vacuum in the wake of the late Bronze Age collapse, in much the same way as happened with the Arameans and with the Neo-Hittites, which are also neglected.
I was going to say, I haven't done a huge deep dive into Amarna, but what I remember there is you can find a character that corresponds very much to like King Saul. But what I didn't see that I've never found reference for was actual kingdoms. It's almost more like city-state sort of setups in
you have city-states, but they have, zones of influence. And the zone of influence of King Labayu of Shechem is roughly equivalent to what you could compare to the archaeologically attested Kingdom of Israel. That it controls, the region of Samaria, the northern West Bank, basically, and tried frequently but failed to conquer the Jezreel Valley. So Labayu is trying to conquer the Jezreel, trying to defeat his rival Biridia of Megiddo. So they are city-states at heart, but they have alliances that give them a wide range of power, and then the influence of one city-state over other city-states. So you can see this parallel in a much earlier period, in the Middle Bronze Age, in Syria and in Mesopotamia, that they created this. The strongest kings will have 15 kings under them. Like, for example, the king of Aleppo was seen as the strongest king because he had 20 subordinate city-states under him. They were separate city-states, but they were subordinate to him. And in much the same way, you would have a king like Labayu, and there would be more minor city-states like Pella and Jenin, like Gina, that would have been subordinate, and there would have been conflicts between the other hegemonic city-states over these border cities.
Oh, no, you hit on a good one, and that's one of where I have the problem is the northern part, Samaria, that is well attested to. It's when I try to look for significance for Jerusalem back in the, in before the Bronze Age collapse and all. It's tough to find anything even remotely there until well after the date. And another one that you brought up, and it's one that I think people need to rework, is the significance of Megiddo. Because the recent archaeology and the temple there that was from the virtually late Paleolithic, where it was larger and more technologically advanced than anything else in the area. And it very much fits that idea of, an ancient, advanced technology in the sense that they were able to do stonework and monuments, much like pre-dynastic Egypt and such.
Well, these Canaanite cities, these hegemonic Canaanite cities, particularly the ones nearer to the coast, had strong ties to Egypt, and in many cases buried their dead in accordance to Egyptian principles rather than accordance to local principles. And also there was a significant Syrian influence. Like Syria was this, gradient zone with Anatolia and with Mesopotamia, and they were more advanced. Culturally, the site of Hazor, which is in the near the Sea of Galilee region, was culturally more similar to what you see in the rest of Syria than it was with what is in like the southern region in Palestine, even though now it's associated with Palestine. But yeah, there is, Hazor was actually one of probably the largest city in the late Bronze Age Near East. It had a population of around 20 to 25,000 people, according to archaeological estimates.
Wait, where you said Hathor?
Like a lot, but
wait. Hathor is in Serbid al-Khadim?
Hazor?
Oh, Hatzor. Sorry, I thought you said Hathor.
Hazor. Yeah, so that was really, really important. So I'm not a biblical maximalist, obviously, but I'm not a hardcore minimalist either. There is extra biblical evidence to a lot of the geopolitical stuff that they included in the Bible because they had no choice but to include it in the Bible. They obviously had sources that they were reading. They even reference, primary sources in the Book of Kings that most likely, if they were ever discovered, which it is the holy grail for biblical archaeology to discover these original chronicles of the kings of Israel, the chronicles of the king of Judah, these would have described the political events around the time of the Book of Kings, but without the theological, invention, without the polemical invention of the biblical text.
Yeah. So this is actually kind of interesting. I ended up looking through the comments here. You actually did comment on this guy's video. He said, Baal, born from the God of heaven, an immortal woman, died for the salvation of mankind, resurrected from the dead, rider on the clouds. Does any of this sound familiar? And then someone said, yeah, Baal is Marduk and Horus. Someone else said, rider on the storm. Someone said, inspiring philosophy debunked this, buddy. So, yep, rest in peace. The funny thing is, inspiring philosophy didn't actually debunk it. He doesn't debunk most things, but and then he said, I think comparing Jesus to Baal is very complimentary to Jesus. And someone said, compare him all day has been debunked. I can do it with you too, so I can make you feel better. And then you said, not sure how it can be debunked since it is subjective. I checked out his channel, and he is a BS Christian apologist. Oh, you're referring to inspiring philosophy. But so I'm actually kind of curious to see what this guy was saying.
Did Matthew think that Jesus was a group of Baal worshippers?
Let me register real quick here.
Yeah,
I just need to register.
Drama.
Sorry, what?
I want to register my traditional complaint about bunking, which is something I do not do and consider a logical fallacy. Bunking or debunking is not a route to truth. It's a route to, basically propaganda. Okay.
Yeah. Although propaganda can be true or untrue, it just means that it's rhetorical. It's making an argument.
Yeah, so much of bunking rests on, appeal to popularity, appeal to authority, which are all logical fallacies. They're not legitimate operations for a truth seeker. So it's a question of, are you, bunking or debunking is trying to, it's persuasion. It's not truth.
So all these apologetics, they don't make an argument based on the facts. They make the facts fit their argument. That's the rhetorical fallacy, I think, that they rely on most.
Exactly. I'm just registering it's a recurring complaint I've had for years, if not decades, where
it's really annoying. And then they say
I neither bunk nor debunk, and I don't have a lot of respect for people who see that as anything reliable or worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Did Matthew think that Jesus was a group of Baal worshippers? Hi everyone, Jason here from spiritualbabies.net. You've joined us for another show in the Two Witnesses series, where we look at the Hebrew text that's been used in the Christian text, and we have a look and see if whether that Christian text has kept the text borrowed from the Hebrew text in the same context. Woo, got that all out in one go. Fantastic. All right, so this is a series based on a book called Two Witnesses. You can find a link to that book down below. You can go and buy that on Amazon. So where are we? We are in the book of Matthew today, and we are looking at a very specific passage denoting a very specific event. And Matthew is quoting from a very specific line in the prophets. So in the Gospels, we're told that Jesus had to escape from the evil King Herod, who was out to kill the babies. And so Joseph and Mary took the baby down into Egypt. And Matthew continues in Matthew 2:14-15. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed unto Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which is spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt I have called my son. So to nutshell that quickly, Herod wants to kill Jesus.
Almost kind of sounds like the idea of, Baal fathers a child, then he dies, and then it's not really until Mut is defeated that life can really flourish and that his son can grow up. And so, I don't know, it's kind of interesting the parallels you could draw with this. Because, and this is something that I meant to say before, that if you think about it, the motif of, that Baal gets swallowed up by death, and in so doing, his, the power of his life, it when Anat grounds up Mot's body, and with it, Baal inside, and basically scatters him like seeds. It's basically kind of going with what you were saying before, that without him dying, you can't have, because on one hand, you already had Mot around, who was consuming mortals, but so it's almost like Baal's death allows him to seed new life, and also that it's almost like he takes Mot down with him.
Yeah, and actually when Baal comes back, so does Mot, which is a funny detail, that they bring Mot back when Baal comes back from the dead, when they drag him back from the underworld. And then they battle again. And it's not resolved by Baal defeating Mot through violence, even though there is violence, they do battle. But how is it resolved? Here's the question.
It's a question, not an answer?
It's resolved by each learning to respect each other's domains, basically.
Interesting. And I think that in a lot of ways that can be more of a healthy understanding of things, that because basically if you view that and again, sure, there's some things where you can view it as this is a lesson, but in general, if everything good and everything bad comes from the same place, kind of insinuates that there's a bit of a personality disorder with whatever's in charge of reality.
Mm-hmm. Well, it leans into the nature of how life isn't really about good versus evil. It's a conflict with more complexity than that. Baal does not represent good per se, although most people would have read his actions as being virtuous, resisting death, resisting, the time of Yom Kippur. But it's not a struggle between good and evil. It's a struggle between life and death. And it's a struggle that peace is made by coming to terms with the fact that there's going to be this struggle for eternity between life and death. Between fertility and reality.
It sounds like you're saying that Baal, to a certain extent, is a Canaanite version of the European Green Man, where he's very much the agricultural, and it's the idea if you can't death can't kill life because death doesn't exist without life. And
Yeah.
the two of them are two sides of the same coin, and that's the balance you have to find. That kind of sounds what you're trying to speak. I say that in my language. So
Exactly. You have it exactly right. And of course, these European myths, these Semitic myths, they all exist as part of a religious milieu that was mixing together long before there was history, before written history existed. History was already going. The things we think of as history were already going. So these ideas already had existed and spread around long before they were ever written down.
Yeah. History never starts or stops.
Yep, those steppe nomads were busy long before history started.
And there was, obviously agriculture before there was writing.
True.
The oldest struggle, of course, is between the agriculturalists and the nomads. You see this in the story of Cain versus Abel, where they choose to represent the nomads, Abel as being the innocent one who's being destroyed. But you can easily imagine how that story could be flipped on its head as being the nomads who are doing the crime against the agriculturalists.
Yeah, I was going to say an interesting interpretation on that one that I saw was Abel was a haughty one and saw himself as superior because of the role that he had. And that was a part of the play. And, it was Abel wasn't totally innocent. He kind of tweaked and provoked Cain with his attitude towards it.
Also, he had to kill an animal in order to, give that sacrifice, whereas Cain gave a grain offering.
Yeah, it also seems to be a political manifestation of different styles of kingship and different styles of political rule from around the Near East. Around the transition between the early Bronze Age to the Middle Bronze Age, the symbols of power went from agricultural symbols of power to nomadic symbols of power, like the king as the shepherd, the king as the judge and the guide for the flock, rather than being the king as the manager, the king as the farmer.
What do you think about that transition happening because of the rise of warfare? Where prior to that, it was much more of a settled build the wealth. And later on, the transition to more of the nomadic sensibility, because armies are nothing but nomadic, tromping through the land. So I see that as a possible connection, Tag.
Well, the earliest political change in recorded history in ancient Sumer was from the former system of rulership, which was of the priest kings, the En, to the Lugal, who is more of the general side of kingship. And that fully became completed, I think, around the time of the Amorite conquests, when the Amorite style of rulership, with all the shepherding stuff, symbology becomes prevalent throughout the Near East, not just in Mesopotamia, but also in Egypt. If you look at, everyone knows what the pharaoh has in his hands. What are the two things he has in his hands?
So that wasn't so prevalent during the Akkadian period?
Wait, during the Akkadian period, it's a period of transition.
He has the crook and the flail, right?
Yeah, the crook and the flail. And they represent the two means of sustenance in the Near East. The flail represents agriculture and the agricultural cycle, and the crook represents the shepherd, and to a greater extent, like the violent aspect of the pharaoh. The flail is the managerial and religious and sedentary aspect of pharaonic rule, and the crook represents the generalship and conquest and sacrifice, the warlike aspect of the pharaoh, the new style of kingship that was brought into Egypt by the Hyksos from Syria, from the Amorites.
Interesting. So here, let's get a bit back into it.
Joseph gets a message to this effect. He takes his wife and the baby, and they flee to Egypt, and they stay there until Herod dies. Matthew is claiming that there was a prophecy to this event in the Hebrew scriptures. So let's go and have a look and see which prophecy he is
My
linking
son,
to.
I called
Matthew's
you.
linking to Hosea 11, and called my son out of Egypt. However, Matthew forgets the beginning of that line. When Israel was a child, I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. So in this verse, Hosea is not looking forward with a prophecy of what's going to happen to Israel, as many of the prophets did from time to time. He's actually looking back and speaking about something historically that happened. Why is the use of the word son okay in this instance? Well, because of Exodus 4:22, in which the Creator says that Israel was his firstborn son. How do we know that Isaiah isn't speaking about some future event, one single person? How do we know that rather than speaking about a future sinless person, he's speaking about a previous sinful nation? Well, it's quite simple. We just keep reading after 11:1. What does 11:2 say? In fact, let's read 11:1 and 2. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. As they called them, so they went from them. They sacrificed to Baals and burned incense to carved images. This is all one line, it's one passage. This is speaking about a people who were called out of Egypt and engaged in sinful idolatry. So either this is about
I
Israel,
saying.
and the Tanakh context is correct, or Matthew is right and it's about Jesus, and Jesus did those things, and there was more than one Jesus, and Jesus was in the plural, and he sacrificed the Baals and did a whole lot of stuff. No, of course not. Why? Because Isaiah wasn't speaking about the future, he was speaking about the past. So the prophet was giving a historical breakdown of what happened to Israel, not what was going to happen to one Israeli, to one Jewish guy. There's almost always an answer to a New Testament question if you just continue reading the source material. Don't ever read the one line. Context, context, context. So there we go. That was this week's show. Thank you very much. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Interesting. I didn't see where he was going until the very end, but I do think that's a good argument. Was Jesus a Baal worshiper, or is it not referring to Jesus?
Well, certainly there was a big motivation to connect the Christian movement to Baal worship by early rabbinic Judaism in the Talmud. And of course, this is a polemical that survived secretly in Judaism, obviously. And now it's become public now that Jewish liberation has been effected. They're no longer afraid. I have this gentleman over here, Rabbi Tobias Singer.
Wait, what?
Is my main figure I made of Rabbi Tobias Singer, who basically just makes that argument about the Christianity just being this new form of Baal worship.
Wait, show it again. Show it again.
Oh, Tobias Singer.
Okay.
Who's also, by the way.
He's what?
He's naked.
Okay. Why does he have breasts?
Because old men have moves. It's a fact of nature.
Okay.
I made up a lot of apologetics and high religious figures for some reason. Like I got off on that. Made Franklin Graham, Imam Zakir Naik. I don't know why I found that entertaining.
Are they voodoo dolls?
No, they're not voodoo dolls. I'm not actually doing any voodoo or hoodoo or any
judo.
Voodoo dolls.
Voodoo. I hate doing voodoo. It's annoying. You have to get your sandals off and put water on your feet with your bare hands. It's nasty.
Reference.
Just to air a quick pet peeve is I was watching this video the other day and I couldn't get past the 2-minute mark because of the pronunciation in there. I don't know about you guys. If somebody keeps going on about the polytheists and the Amorites, and he keeps repeating those words, I can't listen.
Wait,
just
Well, I
can't.
mean, everyone keeps mispronouncing the word Baal. They always say, "Oh, Baal, Baal, Baal did this, Baal did that." It's
Christian,
pronounced Baal. If you can't even pronounce the name of our God, how can you criticize him? You lack critical faculties.
Christian Bale.
It's like Amorites. They're not Greeks.
Wait, did that guy mispronounce it?
No. Cohen, his talk about the Amorites before, it reminded me of that video, and hit the guy's accent sort of like reinforced it for me. Because
So,
the British say controversy, and that's their actual pronunciation. It took me a while to adjust to that one. So tag.
and aluminium. But yeah, here, check this out. These I wasn't aware of this.
In the Bible, there is one very beautiful and evocative psalm, Psalm 29, which I will now read. It's the Psalm of David. Ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. Worship the Lord in holy splendor. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord over mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf, and Sirion like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord causes the oaks to whirl and strips the forest bare. And in his temple all say glory. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. May the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace. This is indeed beautiful and highly evocative psalm, which portrays the Lord, Yahweh, as God of storm. And now I would like to share with you something from my background, somewhere where I attained a PhD in study of Ugaritic texts.
Ooh, nice.
Ugaritic texts are coming to us from 12th to 13th century before Common Era. And they were written in a cuneiform script and written in a language very similar to Hebrew Bible. I translated those religious texts from that city. It's in Syria these days. And religious texts are very, very similar to those we have in the Bible. And now I would like to read to you a few lines from a specific myth, a cycle of Baal. And finally, Baal will appoint the season of his reigns, the season when he appears with his storm chariot, and the sending forth of his mighty voice from clouds, and hurling to the earth of his lighting flashes. That's before he is able to build his temple, his house. But then, after that house is built, we hear this celebration. Baal opened a rift in the clouds. His holy voice Baal gave forth. Baal repeated the utterance of his lips. At his holy voice, the earth quaked. At the utterance of his lips, the mountains were terrified. The ancient mountains were afraid. The hills of the earth trembled. You can recognize that these are really quite similar images they are trying to evoke and inspire in us. So from the time of discovery of these Ugaritic texts, which was the early part of the 20th century, there was a quite interest in these texts and also recognition of the closeness of Psalm 29 and these images of taken from Canaanite myths. And scholars are now almost certain that Psalm 29 is really going back
Pretty
to
clear
this
to me that
pre-biblical religion. You can almost replace the Lord,
Yep.
Yahweh,
with a
in
mighty hand
Psalm
and an outstretched
with God
arm.
Baal or name Baal, and you will have exactly the psalm which Canaanite people might sing. And
He
it is
seems
marvelous
like a
to
legit
recognize
scholar and
that
not just an
truly
apologist.
Yeah.
this Psalm 29 we have in the Bible. We are really reaching out to ancient religion, pre-monotheistic religion, and we are touching the roots of civilization. It is being preserved.
Again, given what we know, wouldn't surprise me if a lot of the Psalms were appropriated from elsewhere, like, the Song of the Aten.
Interesting.
If I'm not mistaken, there was one of the psalms that seemed to have been performed, or contextually could have been performed at the marriage of Ahab and Jezebel.
What do you mean?
There was one of the psalms that it reads like a wedding hymn between Ahab and Jezebel. You can look that up if you're curious. I did an AI recording of it, by the way.
Interesting.
But it was a very important political marriage, as I said, to mark the alliance between the Tyrians and the kingdom of Israel, not just as trading partners, but also as political allies against the Assyrians, which ultimately, like, the Tyrians decided not to join the coalition against the Assyrians, perhaps because of the murder of their princess and the harassment of her family. So it goes to show the effects of this historical cult of Yahweh, if there's to be believed this cult of Yahweh existed.
One second. Here, let me put this on. I have to respond to text.
Dear friends, can you imagine God as a joyrider? According to the Bible, God is riding in a borrowed vehicle. In Psalm 104, the third verse, God, Yahweh, is riding a cloud chariot. Well, you might think, what a lovely and playful metaphor. And it makes good sense. The realm of gods is in the heavens. And at that time, from Middle Bronze Age or about, chariots were really an advanced and truly aristocratic mode of transportation. Problem is that title, charioteer of the clouds, was a standard and well-established title of the Canaanite god Baal. This Baal's title appears countless of times in the Canaanite mythology, and it is so common that it could designate this god Baal without even naming him. And we know that biblical religion grew out of this Canaanite polytheistic milieu. And as it grew ever more monotheistic and also centralized, God Baal was attacked, suppressed, and pushed out. In this process, many of important Baal's functions, characteristics, and his titles were taken over and adopted by God Yahweh, God of the Old Testament. Charioteer of the clouds is one such function and title. It was a beautiful Canaanite polytheistic metaphor which was adopted and preserved in our Bible. Thus, indeed, in the Bible, God is riding confiscated
or carjacked heavenly vehicle. And that is something you might not know about the Bible. Join us this Pentecostal Sunday when we return to Psalm 104. And
I wonder if he talks anything about like Baal and Jesus.
Yeah, the resurrection myth. I mean, there was. I think to get to the idea of the resurrection and the Son of God needing to be sacrificed by God Himself. There's a really interesting case of that preserved in the works of Eusebius of Caesarea, but quoted from Philo of Byblos. See if I can find. I was reading that source the other day, and it describes, El as making a sacrifice of his own son, and naturally that would have parallels, And it's always El that is associated with Kronos, and in the ancient, Roman and Greek historiography of human sacrifice in Carthage, in Syria, it's always Kronos who is described as having the brazen image where the children are sacrificed, never the figure equated with Baal, which is interesting.
Oh yeah, and because I remember people have been saying, because like now that scholarship shows that Moloch was almost certainly not actually a deity and is in its own right, it was actually like a type of sacrifice or ritual, that people are thinking that it was performed in worship or in reverence to El, not to Baal. But people are saying that it was to Baal because it's more difficult to demonize El, because El is also one of the names of God in the Bible.
It is. And the interesting thing is that most of the resources, like from an in-community reference to their community practicing human sacrifice, within the Canaanite context comes from the Bible. They describe themselves as making human sacrifices to El.
Interesting.
There's a part of me that has always been suspicious that the sacrifices were made to Tanit.
Why?
Because Tanit seemed to be more the primary deity of Carthage and the Punic religion.
Well, yeah, but of Carthage, but not elsewhere.
There's a large female element there. You're talking that got snuffed. You know that it got snuffed later on when they took out Asherah and all that. And the idea that you're sacrificing and who you're sacrificing to is the female, the female goddess, the female agriculture goddess, and what you're sacrificing is the male.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because almost all of the Greco-Roman sources that reference this sacrifice, they always attribute it to the worship of Kronos, the male god, the version of Saturn, basically.
I know. That's what I'm saying. I've always been suspicious that that's been a mistake or, just a misdirection or something. Because Kronos doesn't fit anywhere near as well for me as Tanit does. That's all.
Tanit is an interesting case because she seems to have been this proto-Afroasiatic deity that has been prevalent throughout the ancient Mediterranean in different forms. In Egypt as Neith, in the Canaanite mythos as Anat, and in Greece as Athena, or Minerva among the Etruscans and the Romans. That would have been a big shocker.
And again, the whole idea of sacrificing the males to the goddess, that fits in with Kybele and all that, which is in there.
Well, no, in that case, they were specifically sacrificing a part of the male, not the entire male.
In the ancient world, if you're sacrificing your future children, that's essentially the same thing in a large sense.
That is certainly true. But you sacrifice your manhood to the goddess, but you sacrifice the sons to God. You actually sacrifice the lamb to God.
What's up to do with the lamb?
Well, because the lamb is the person who sacrificed.
Oh,
It's interesting that they had a practice of actual substitution, according to the Greek sources, which are of course themselves biased. Because actually the Greeks had more of a grievance against the Carthaginians than the Romans did, actually. That they had more historical enmity with the Carthaginians than the Romans, and the Romans kind of inherited that cultural enmity from the Greeks. But according to the Greek source from Diodorus Siculus, they had a custom by which the aristocrats were supposed to offer their own children as sacrifices, but they were using surrogates, lower class children that were maybe being exposed or they were purchasing or kidnapping, and using them as a substitute sacrifice. And that's why the gods were angry, or how the superstitious among them considered the gods to be angry at them for that.
So this kind
Why
of goes,
is it?
sorry. I was just going to say this next video kind of goes into the point of the whole video, or the stream.
Okay.
Yeah,
Then let me slide this one in real quick then. Why would anybody be surprised that the same group that would hire an army to fight their wars would also outsource their children for sacrifice? Tag.
Well, it's certainly a characteristic that the Romans and Greeks were eager to present the Carthaginians as doing, as being shady merchants who would even shortchange their own gods.
Well, I was going to say, from the Greek standpoint, that was professional jealousy. They were kind of upset that the Phoenicians were able to be even shadier than the Greeks, as
difficult
Homer
as
said,
that is.
Beware of Greeks bearing gifts.
Dear friends, did Jesus look over the shoulder of a pagan to copy his mythology?
This is perfect.
To explain a little
He's put in
further,
a box.
in the Ugaritic mythological text, there is this interesting part of Baal myth. It is on the tablet 6 of the cycle about God Baal, or Baal as pronounced in America. Quoting, Goddess Anat,
Shots
grasps
fired.
divine Maud. With the threshing blades she split him. With a fan she winnowed him. With fire she parched him. With millstones she ground him. On the steppe she scattered him. In the furrows she sowed him. His remains the birds did indeed eat. His remnants the sparrows did indeed consume.
He sounds like Tommy
Recognize
Wiseau.
how similar it is to the parable
Yeah.
which
Oh,
Jesus
what's
said
the-
about
Oh, hi,
different
Mark.
seeds landing in different soils
Oh, hi,
and
Paul.
their different destinies. Well, I'm not suggesting that Jesus copied this ancient Canaanite myth. Of course, he did not directly quote that myth. They were 1,200 years older and were buried in the ruins
That's a
of that
sneaky thing you
city
did
for
there, but I
centuries.
agree.
But Jesus was drawing from the same treasure of religious metaphors. These religious metaphors about grain, they date from great antiquity, from the beginning, from the dawn of civilization, the beginning of farming thousands of years before time of Jesus or Ugarit. And friends, here we are not limited to Hebrew or Semitic people in thousands of years before time of Jesus or Ugarit. And friends, here we are not limited to Hebrew or Semitic people. It is likely that similar grain metaphors played a pivotal role in the Greek Eleusinian mysteries. Jesus is also not the only one in the New Testament who uses this grain metaphor in his time. Apostle Paul reached out to the same source when he tried to explain to Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15 the resurrection.
Never
He
mind.
used a similar metaphor of a grain being buried and then rising to new life.
Interesting.
And thus, through Apostle Paul and parables of Jesus, we share this important, meaningful, and beautiful connection with the dawn of civilization, beginning of agriculture, and the oldest shared hopes about transcending our mortality. And that is something you might not know about the Bible and about the New Testament metaphors and their deep, meaningful, mythical roots.
Okay, I think we've watched enough videos. Maybe we can give some of our own analysis now.
Yeah, so like I definitely think it's interesting because, especially nowadays, because of how much you have, disconnection from agriculture that most people do. A lot of this stuff doesn't really even ring true.
I think people are just not even just disconnection from agriculture, but from a disconnection from nature itself, or from even human nature itself. So many of the metaphors of ancient religion don't seem to make sense in the light of the world that we built for ourselves, the prison we built for ourselves. So many people feel like their home is a prison, that they can't go anywhere, that they're sort of like trapped in their digital or domicile prison. And back in those days, people would get to feel the changing of the seasons, and they would need to, crave the changing of the seasons in a way that's less superficial. We joke about how small talk is, how's the weather? But that wasn't small talk in antiquity. That was the big talk. How is the weather looking like? How is the weather going? Because that's survival. And as people get more and more separated from nature, they are also getting more and more separated from the divine, because nature is essentially the source of ideas of the divine. The divine cannot exist in a world where people's reality is so synthetic and false to what we are as humans.
For me, I think the biggest disconnect in the modern world is the sense of causality and consequence and responsibility. I think people are going through life without any sense that their actions actually matter. And should their actions matter and have a negative consequence, well, dear Lord, they can't even handle anything negative these days.
I mean, it's very painful. I'm not going to name events in my life where I suffered a serious consequence as a result of a ethical mistake, and it's a devastating thing to live with, the consequence of your mistake. And that is so central to the mythology of the ancient world, that you get the hero of the ancient stories. The heroes of the ancient stories are the ones who make the mistakes and suffer the consequences, whether it be in Greek mythology, whether it be in Canaanite mythology. The cause and effect, the consequence of the action is so central to Canaanite mythology.
That was the essence of mythology and religion back in the day, was how do you live a life? How do you live as an adult? And these days, I swear, I think some people are graduating high school and college without ever actually being tested, without ever actually been told that they're wrong, that they made a mistake. And if you try to tell them they made a mistake, they melt down emotionally. Heck.
No, it's not just people who graduate from high school and college. It's people much older than that. Nowadays, we have, back in the day, if you were an old person, if you lived to the age of 97, that is impossible to do unless you have some kind of wisdom, unless you have some kind of inner strength getting you through all the trials. But you see so many old people now who believe they are due the respective age without ever having been tested in historical ways, the ways that historical people were tested, and that has a big impact on society. We are currently, the young people are paying the price for the fact that the older generations, the boomer generation, was brought up in a time of absolute prosperity and luxury, and we're brought up with the expectation that we're going to have that, and we're just confronted with the reality that we are not prepared for the reality we live in. I'm almost 30, and I haven't had many proper jobs. I've been serious about looking for them and been serious about the ones I've had, but there's just no stability in that. I'm not going to find a job that lasts anymore.
Now we're going off the book here, but part of the problem is the boomers were absentee parents.
Even in my case, I had really good parents. I had a stay-at-home mom. I had
I'm saying as a group. I'm saying as a group with the kids is they didn't pass on any sort of things. They sort of kind of raised themselves and rebelled, and they kind of were hands off on their kids as a response.
Well, it's kind of also a consumer identity as well. When something went wrong, let's say in the 1930s, with my grandparents' generation, my great grandparents' generation, they got out and they had to fix it, or else it wouldn't get fixed. With my dad and my mom, their generation, the expectation is if something went wrong with the plumbing, you phone the plumber. You don't have to go and fix it. You don't have to build your own furniture. You don't have to work with your hands. And as a result, a lot of people in my generation never learned to work with their hands. They never learned how to fix pipes or electric appliances. And everything is kind of built to break down, so you just need to buy the next one. Where capitalism is the most efficient form of economics in transforming resources into garbage.
Well, capitalism isn't designed to put out a quality product. No. It's designed to make money for stockholders.
Yeah, it's kind of like the AI that's designed to make paper clips.
It's like a predator. Capitalism, I don't know if anybody hasn't seen the documentary The Corporation, I highly recommend it. But essentially, if you do a psychological profile on a corporation, they come back as basically a vampiric psychopath, where they have no feelings for others. All they care about is extracting resources, regardless of the cost or hurt that causes to other people. They're eternal. They're immortal. No, it's capitalism run amok. Absentee ownership is the biggest problem with capitalism.
I mean, it takes away personal responsibility, as I said. The whole deal of the LLC is one individual cannot any longer face criminal or even personal responsibility for the actions of the company because the company is said to take action collectively.
Well, now you're talking about the issue. Now you're talking about an issue with the legal system.
Well, it's not just the legal system, it's an issue with the moral system. That you get a person like Brian Thompson and they say, oh, it's such a tragedy that he was killed, as if he wasn't responsible for the issues in part of the corporation that he was a part of. That this is about, like Pilate washing his hands of his sin, or it's also about, the lamb of sacrifice. We can say McDonald's is an evil corporation, Walmart is an evil corporation, to distract from the fact that it's a group of people who collectively take immoral actions, immoral decisions, and then they pretend that they are this amorphous system rather than just being themselves individuals doing what benefits themselves.
I'm going to be slightly technical and say they're not immoral, they're amoral.
Yeah,
they lack all morality. A corporation would be perfectly fine with feeding the poor if there was money to be made there.
Yeah,
that's all they care about is making money. If doing good things will make them money, they'll do good things.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, that I've heard this quote once, that people find it easier to accept the end of civilization than the end of capitalism, even though capitalism is actually a very recent innovation in society.
Yeah, it's about 400 years, give or take.
Yeah, well, give or take, but industrial capitalism maybe 200 years, maybe less.
Well, the corporation in America is a rise post Civil War. That's the second half of the 1800s.
I mean, even in Marx's time, he's describing a state of affairs that doesn't yet fully take over society, but he can see society is transitioning in that direction.
Unfortunately, Marx overcorrected and went toxic in the opposite direction.
I think the thing about Marx is actually probably was unwilling to fully flesh out his own ideas, because he's called a communist and he's a socialist, but he devotes so much effort fleshing out why capitalism destroys itself, why capitalism is bad, and why it does lead through Hegelian dialectics to socialism, but he doesn't really, because he's afraid of sounding utopian, flesh out a society that he actually considers ideal, which is, I think, the cardinal sin of Marx. He never properly fleshes out his idea of what's good rather than what's bad. Which is
and he also, the other one is the having to link everything to materialism. And you hit on a key aspect, and that is Marx is simply one variety of Hegelian.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the big sin, Hegelian dialectics is, as a historian, I think it's absolutely trash, and probably that's the ideological failure of Marxism, is that Hegelianism does not describe the history of humanity.
Oh, I go the other way. I think Hegel was right. I think there are a lot of Hegelians that took his ideas down some absolute blind rabbit holes. I was going to say one of the ones I actually liked was Max Stirner, who his stuff is so far abstract, but he took it to his logical consequences.
Well, I disagree with the idea that history has trended towards progress. That's what I take issue with. And the other thing I think I take issue with Marxism is it essentially critiques capitalism, but in effect, it's attempting to essentially be capitalism. In practice, China does not achieve socialism by addressing the sins of capitalism, but by outcompeting capitalism. That's the idea, is it buys into the capitalist myth rather than actually proposing something else.
Just how socialist or capitalist China is a whole can of worms that's beyond this topic today.
Yeah, well, that's a whole debate. But it does seem like very much the Marxist interpretation is that they need to compete with capitalism in the same measure of success that capitalist societies measure their success, with innovation, with quote-unquote prosperity, with productivity. And that I think is also one of the cardinal sins of socialist experiments in history, is their ideal of connecting rather than with a spiritual connection, as you said, the spiritual connection with the land. They chose to focus on a very, very materialistic goal, which is building wealth, building material growth.
Interesting.
They needed to achieve socialism, but you don't. The Hopi people essentially achieved socialism not by pursuing plenty, but by accepting scarcity, I guess, and their place in a society that is a fully superstitious society. That the most egalitarian societies in history are egalitarian not because they're the most rational, but in many cases because they're the most superstitious. They are spiritualist in that they cannot harm this other group of people. They cannot even harm animals or trees. because they fear retribution, they fear political consequences. But divine.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of times they're also the poorest and the least and have the least power. You know,
the idea is, why is power and wealth seen as this ultimate good when it is objectively so destructive?
Well, I was going to say the aspect that you were talking there that was different than how I was educated for socialism and communism is socialism and communism, they are materialistic, but their goal wasn't so much, the Soviet Union and China accepted. The goal wasn't so much progress as it was equality for the people. How do we have the good, how do we provide the best for all the people? It's like, Castro in Cuba is a great example where, for decades, if you were not in the United States or Canada, what country do you want to be in the Western Hemisphere? And pretty much, if you want a high literacy rate, a high life expectancy, quality healthcare, you got Cuba, and anything else is a major step below Cuba.
Mm-hmm. Cuba or one of those South American countries, depending on what time period. Yeah, I mean, there was a time when Argentina and Chile were very successful as well.
Yeah, and that was how I was raised as it. It was the idea of you're not trying to force the innovation as much. I understand, the whole Soviet Union versus U.S. competition and now China, but, they're kind of exceptions there. That's much more of nation state versus nation state than the economic systems.
It does seem very clear that Cuba, as a socialist experiment, tended to go in a very, very different direction than the mainstream of the Soviet Union or of China. That they really focused on walking their own path of building their own country up and, taking what they could from what they had ideologically to benefit their society. They're coming at it from the position of what will benefit society. Ultimately, I think that was one of the major influences in China later on, that they're focusing.
Oh yeah, no, that's one of the things that's counterintuitive as it was to Americans, is the idea that Fidel Castro was absolutely loved in Cuba, because if he wasn't, they could have gotten rid of him at any point in time.
It's kind of similar, a bit different, but similar with Bukele. He actually, his people love him, and that's part of what's so disturbing with everything going on.
Well, they have suffered under a criminal narco empire that previous liberal governments refused to do anything about, because essentially,
Batista in Cuba.
Basically, it's just socialism without the ethics or the intelligence.
Yeah, and
same thing in Cuba. Batista was a monster. Tag.
But yeah, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have done something about all the gang violence there. I just think that it's dangerous, because the fact that he's so beloved means that now that there's criminals that aren't even from El Salvador that are being sent there.
And this is where I'm going to stick up for Hegel a little bit, where you see the pendulum swing back and forth as history progresses, where you have, a wrong done one direction, then you see an overcorrection and wrongs done in the other direction, and the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth until it finally comes to rest at some point.
Well, he's definitely right about the dialectic. I think that's his best idea by far, and very, very descriptive of historical practice. Although I don't think he invented that concept. The idea of yin and yang and other sort of concepts around that, of balance and harmony. Even in the Baal epic, you see this between the peace between Baal and Moses, the different aspects of nature in conflict, but eventually finding harmony, is a spiritual is framed as spiritual when it's from a non-Western context, but is framed as rationalist when Hegel
Absolutely.
is applying the Western historiographical process to it. But it's the same idea.
Oh, you nail it. That's why, for my metaphysics, I use it's basically it's a monism, but it's dialectical monism, where the monad can only be expressed as a duality. It can't express its unity. It can only be expressed as two complementary opposites.
I did another video on my channel actually where monotheism cannot exist without, essentially the monotheism can't exist. It has to be duotheist to deal with the problem of evil or the problem of conflict more accurately.
But that just becomes a matter of perspective, to quote Obi-Wan, where if you have the two duals dissolving into the larger dialectic, into the larger synthesis, then you can say that synthesis is the monotheistic God, and the other two are just lower gods. And that's one of the things that I've noticed through my studies is any dualistic religion is also going to have basically a monotheistic, a synthesis above it. It's like, the classic one, Zoroastrianism, where it actually has its own unitary solution in Zurbanism, which they of course declared heretical and killed people who followed it. But that's how it works.
This idea of like monotheism versus polytheism, this is a false distinction because it all revolves around the idea of the definition of gods versus God. What monotheists typically today believe in is the Neoplatonist construction of the one, the ultimate nature of reality, which is not at all incompatible with gods or deities as is expressed through polytheism in Hinduism, in Greek religion, and in Canaanite religion. They all have this concept of a one, a nature of reality that came out of the synthesis of opposing forces. That's actually the creation myth of ancient Canaan recollected in Sanchuniathon is of the world coming to be out of the synthesis of two principles. And that is the centrality, of course, of sex in Canaanite religion, because that is what sex is. It's the synthesis of two principles to create a new being.
Exactly.
But also, that is the reason why the Abrahamic tradition is so eager to conflate sexuality with sin, because what sex is at its heart is a challenge to the idea of monotheism or the misinterpretation of spirituality that gives rise to the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic concept of monotheism.
No, I was going to sit there and say you got it in the Norse mythology, where you have the dialectic of ice and fire and Gnib-Gadap, or whatever you pronounce it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it doesn't really matter specifically what symbolic force you use. The dialectic informs the spiritual as well as the material. It's the fundamental nature of all reality is just this concept, I guess.
For me, I find that the problem is that people struggle with trying, reality is simple. Reality works as it works. Is when you try to translate that into words and concepts that things tend to get muddled up, because it's sort of like trying to unpack a can of worms and then trying to make it fit back in the box again. Doesn't always go well.
No, that is an interesting, like when I was actually traveling in the occupied territories and Palestine, I had this notion that I don't know why I didn't think of before, but it's been very foundational to my ideology going forward, is what is real is what is manifestly real. That there is a reality to life, and you have to engage with that reality rather than fighting with it. rather than making an idea that conflicts with reality, you have to essentially surrender to reality if you want to exist in the world comfortably, to harmonize with the world.
Interesting. No, my resolution for that is that everything is both real and unreal at the same time, depending on which level you're looking at it on. It's like every person's feelings are real. But you know what? Other people's feelings, they're not necessarily as real as my feelings are to me. It's a question of context, and what's real in one context can be not real in another, and vice versa. Thanks.
Is it interesting, the focus of religion in the ancient world was to react and engage with the natural world as it was understood. What is the purpose and function of religion in the modern world?
Actually, I don't see that as the function of religion in the ancient world. I see that much more of a function of spirituality.
Well, there's a line between spirituality and religion. Religion is just the public performance of spirituality.
Oh, yeah, no, to me, that's a very firm line, is religion is basically spirituality for an entire group, which will often conflict with, what's good for the group isn't necessarily good for every member of that group.
And well, I mean to say, what was the purpose of ritual and, let's say, the societal and mythical function of religion, or what we would call religion, or call spirituality, in the polytheistic Near East classical world, ancient India, ancient Americas, whatever.
The nature of it is the building of the group egregore, the bonding of the unity, the group identity.
Well, it's a functional goal, right? You would admit it's a functional goal.
I will say this: Baal is pretty tasty, grain.
I would argue that in the ancient world, they sought to view religion as transactional fundamentally. They made sacrifices to the gods, but they didn't do it strictly out of worship and reverence of the gods just because they worshipped and revered the gods. It was transactional. There was mutual expectation. They did it out of a recognition that if they did not make the prerequisite sacrifices, there would be consequences in the real world for it. Today, the religion services the function of preservation of a tradition that no longer fits with our mode of living, I would say. When I saw the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem in this 120-degree weather with their thick black kaftan frocks and their big old shtreimels, and I'm melting. I'm from Tucson. I'm from fucking Tucson. I'm in a t-shirt, or I'm actually wearing this jello, but no shirt under here. And I'm melting in this heat, and they're wearing their frocks and their giant shtreimels. I'm like, they don't understand reality on a fundamental level. They are forcing their reality. They're forcing themselves to conform to a reality of tradition rather than a reality informed by experience, informed by nature, as it were. They have to dress like this because this is how they dressed in Poland, in Lithuania. This is how their ancestors dressed.
That is one of the traditional aspects of a religion that dates back to the beginning of time, is every single religion has some sort of irrational, signifier by which they can identify themselves. Whether that's like circumcision or wearing specific clothing, every religion has it. It's inherently irrational. It doesn't serve a purpose other than identifying them as a member of that faith or religion.
Is that really an identification as a member of a religion or more as a member of a cultural group? Because I see the circumcision practice that's practiced by Jews and by Muslims today as arriving out of an Egyptian national natural custom
For
that
me,
was
religion
a
and
need
culture.
signifier and a coming of
For
age
me,
signifier.
religion and culture are, potato to a large extent. I see in the
Well,
ancient world that originally humanity was segregated into basically, genetic, region, and cultural, basically a combo. Those were indistinguishable and, evolved, co-evolved together.
well, obviously, religion had to come into existence with relation to the natural and economic realities of the place that it's in. In agricultural societies, you expect to find agricultural deities. Like they're going to tell you, we have Baal, he's an agricultural deity. He represents the symbolism of agriculture, but he
So
also
religion,
represents, in a certain sense, this
I'm
the
pretty
symbolism
basic.
of,
Yeah,
yes.
I'm pretty basic in my definitions. Religion evolved in order to basically, serve the group and organize the group for a larger purpose.
Well, isn't
And
that
in
what
modern
religion
society,
should do? It should
here's the thing:
evolve.
you were questioning about the role of religion in modern life. I think I see lots of religions you don't. Where, this weekend, you got a lot of religious worshiping as the NBA playoffs kicked off. Any sort of
Here in
sporting
Chicago, we
event.
have football. We have the Green Boys, and then the other group, the heretical sect, they cross out Green Boys and they put in girls. So it's
Yeah,
just like the Christians versus the pagans in ancient Alexandria fighting each other. But you're
or the
dead right
Christians
about
versus Lions in Rome, where I'm rooting for the Lions.
It reminds me of the oldest Jewish joke. I can tell you, it's just for entertainment for the audience. So this was after the first Jewish war. They were feeding the Jewish prisoners to the lions in the Colosseum. They built, of course, the Colosseum with the loot from the Jewish temple. And the lions weren't eating anyone. So the guy in the audience said, "Hey, they must not be eating anyone because they're not hungry." So Caesar threw him to the lions, and the lion ate him. And then that's the earliest Jewish joke, by the way.
And here, again, I always heard the oldest Jewish joke is, why do Jewish men get circumcised?
Because otherwise, what was the answer?
Off.
Because Jewish women prefer 10% off.
That's the first answer. That's not a Jewish joke. That's the opposite. But anyway, that's a funny one. I like it. People think that that Judaism has a prohibition against eating pork. That's not true. It's only a prohibition against eating pork at certain restaurants.
Wait, what?
I still remember a lot of people blowing their gasket at McDonald's when they found out that oil was not kosher.
Wait, they expected it to be?
Oh, yeah. They had it had been investigated, and McDonald's had maintained, I want to say that was up until the 90s, that that the French fries qualified as kosher.
Well, if it's before 9/11, that's BC times, man.
Before crazy.
I know, right? Yeah, I mean, every era, people who talk about how these are unprecedented times. These times are completely precedented. History is apes going ape shit. It's all been crazy. The whole thing has been crazy. The problem is we are so caught up in our own present events that we fail to recognize that our ancestors were as stupid as us.
Well, we are the planet of the apes.
I know that's true.
Yeah, I was going to say, the whole Florida State shooting here is that's nothing new. I mean, my cousin was at Kent State when that shooting happened back in 1970.
It does seem like there's much more shootings now than there were before. well, it's not a seeming thing. There is data to suggest that mass shootings have been precipitously increasing.
Well, they're much more fashionable these days.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's
I
because
mean,
That's
to be fair, Kent State was National Guard doing the shooting. It wasn't, some random psychotic student.
well, you could just say it wasn't a student, but the other stuff I don't know that you could apply. But I will say I think that this is what happens when you have not enough fall and you have too much mud.
I mean, the reverence for essentially the life after death, above life itself, that you see in Christianity, that you see in Islam, not so much in Judaism, as most Jews are not particularly preoccupied with the afterlife. This is Mot worship. This is worshiping Mot ahead of Baal in its purest form. And that, I think, is the cardinal sin of Christianity, is they took this myth of Baal, but instead of coming to the conclusion of synthesis, essentially their Baal surrenders to Mot and says, you know what, Mot is superior to me. I am going to bow to him.
I was going to say, in my opinion, the cardinal sin of Christianity was to abandon what happened during the first century with Jesus.
Well, who knows what Jesus actually said? He probably existed. He almost certainly existed. I'm with the majority of historians and archaeologists who will say Jesus almost certainly existed, but who will be with the majority of historians and archaeologists who say, yeah, he existed, but almost nothing could be said with any real certainty about him or his early movement. Because
I was going to say, one thing I know for certain is I don't blame Jesus for the stuff the Catholic Church or any of the other churches have done in the last 1,700 years.
Certainly not. Well, you can't criticize Jesus because that's like criticizing Enoch. What we know about Jesus that is verifiably Jesus as a historical figure rather than as a mythical figure is he was crucified, he was a rabbi, and make of that what you will. There's just so little known about the historical figure of Jesus, so little that anything, it's a philosophical enterprise to go through the discrete philosophical teachings in the Gospels and to play them off of the ideology of the later church and what contradicts, what the church is trying to put out. Maybe this is something more authentic, but even that you don't know for sure. So you can't really criticize Jesus because even though Jesus existed, Jesus as a historical figure is unsubstantiable in terms of ideological underpinnings.
Yeah, for me, it's sort of like trying to blame George Washington for the stuff the CIA does.
Well, also George Washington. You can blame George Washington for a lot of things, but he didn't give a start to the CIA.
Oh, yeah, he may have committed war crimes in the French and Indian War, but I can't blame the CIA on him.
Well, he did start apparently started the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War more generally, which is interesting. That's why he was famous. That's why he was famous enough to be elected the leader of the Continental Army, not because he was a genius or a war hero, but because he was the only American military figure with any fame because he stumbled into starting like World War Zero.
Oh, no, he didn't actually start it, but it definitely was World War Zero, where you had battles, in the Far East on every continent. Yep.
Although to be honest, there's really the concept of a world war, as I was talking about earlier, goes back at the very least to the 15 and 1600s with the wars of religion and this, conflict between Protestants and Catholics, but also between Christians and Muslims that led to the imperialist colonization of the wider world and the creation of the capitalist system, the capitalist status quo, as we know it, with its bicentennial slugfests. But people tend to discount the 17th century. For some reason, they just don't like it so much. They just don't like the vibes. It's not as
Yeah, it was
sexy
an
as
interesting
the Tudor
period.
era. But I think the 17th century is ridiculously important, even though it's like something so far removed from what I'm talking about. We want to talk about the ideological underpinnings of the evils of today's society. If you're talking about the 17th century, in my opinion. Even with Zionism, it kind of has its roots in the 17th century. We're talking about Protestant millenarianism and its influence on Shabbatai Tzvi, who's the first Jewish Zionist. Now we're getting political again. This video is all over the place.
No, I never thought about him as the first Jewish Zionist. I'd have to look into that.
I invite you to look into it. He was very, very influenced, of course, by Protestants, because what was his dad? His dad was a merchant who traded with the English, and in particular with the Levant Company, who did a lot of business.
I'm familiar with him. I'm not sure who I would think of trying before him and who I would consider as a potential Zionist before him. That's all.
He's obviously not like a full Zionist. He's probably more like a proto-Zionist. But the idea of a political Judaism, it doesn't really so much go before him, at least in the modern era.
I was going to say, I think to a certain extent you could argue that the Crusades were Zionist, but yeah.
Well, they are Zionist in that they are an attempt to reclaim the land of Palestine from the Muslims, but it's not being done by Jews. It's being done by Christians, and the Jews are the victims of that, along with the Muslims and the Christians who were there.
I think there were probably Jews on both sides of that war.
I wouldn't say that there were so many Jews. Well, I mean, the Jews were really getting the shit ended in both the Middle East and in Europe, because there were so many crusaders who were like, I don't really want to go to the Middle East this time. I'd rather just burn.
I was going to sit there and say I don't think they got quite as bad of treatment in Venice there. I think they probably had it pretty nice in Venice during that time.
No, I'm not talking about Venice. I'm talking about in the Rhineland. It was the biggest catastrophe, by the way, of the Ashkenazi community in its history. Worse than the Holocaust, by the way, in terms of the genetic bottleneck of the Ashkenazi population, where if you think about it, only 50 women are the ancestors of every Ashkenazi Jew alive today. Because of this genetic bottleneck, during the Black Death and during the Crusades, this period of serious persecution of Jewish people in the Rhineland, which led to the depopulation of the Ashkenazi homeland, which is the Rhineland, and they're east to Poland.
And then, so you said that it was 50 women, but wasn't it something like a majority of Jews are descended from 4 women, and then it's that you also have like the others as well?
That is, yes, and that's why Ashkenazi DNA, while it's not particularly distinct from that of other Jews, it's really easy to recognize Ashkenazi DNA because we are so fucking inbred. We're the Mormons of Europe, basically.
I was going to sit there and say it's not so much for women as it is for mitochondrial haplogroups.
Yes, well, yeah, kind of.
Well, well, that's the thing is you could have, a mother gives birth to 4 daughters. All of them have exactly the same mitochondrial, and they would still count as, the same sort of that's what I'm saying is a little fast and loose with the facts to say it was just 4 women. You don't know when.
It's fair to say that it was and of course with the historical record, this was seen as the enormous catastrophe of the Jewish people at the time this was happening. This was worse, by the way, as far as like casualty rates. It wasn't even comparable to the casualty rates committed by the Spanish during the Spanish Inquisition. it was a million times worse, but it doesn't have this position in modern day discourse because I think we overshadow it so much with the Holocaust and even with these Russian pogroms that happened just so much more recently. And then, of course, you have this black myth to stain Spain because Spain is Western, it is European, but it's not sufficiently Western, it's not sufficiently European. Spain is still seen as being stained by Islamic influence, by Moroccan and African influence, that even though Latin America is every bit as Western culturally as North America, it's still seen as something separate because of this stain of, Morocco on Spain.
I was going to say, for me, it's more of a division between a Mediterranean culture and a Northern European culture.
But they don't have this same, ideology when it comes to Greece or Italy, which are equally Mediterranean and equally, they're more integrated, in fact, into the Near East than Spain is. Spain is actually, Morocco is more integrated into Europe historically than it is to the Near East. But it's because it's in Africa and because it's Islamic, ideologically, it has to be other, it has to be different. And Greece, because it's got this historiographical position at the origin of Western civilization, we can't admit that it's culturally part of the Near East.
Well, Greece also went back and forth. Greece was a liminal one that went back and forth between the two cultures, depending on which century it was.
It's hard to even say that there are two cultures because they're two sides of the same coin. People say that the foundations of Western society is Greco-Roman culture and Judeo-Christian culture. What is the foundation of Islamic society? Greco-Roman culture and Judeo-Christian culture. And
I was thinking more East versus West in the most general idea of West is focused on the individual, and East is more focused on the community.
Well, I don't really see that as regards to a significant difference between Islamic culture and Western culture. I don't see the West as being more individualistic, really, than the Islamic world. Having lived in the Islamic world for close to 2 years now, I almost see it as more individualistic in a certain way. Individualistic, but passively individualistic.
And I come the exact opposite perspective, because to me, the initial command of Islam, thou shalt submit thy will to Allah, is an abrogation of your individuality.
Well,
It's saying, me as an individual doesn't matter. I don't matter. I'm just going to subsume myself into the collective.
Well, here's the question. Is that really significantly different than the Christian underpinning of Europe? Because Christianity isn't about, individuality. Capitalism is about individuality. But capitalism is a new innovation in the West. But
I see the Christianity, Dark Age Christianity, as a means of controlling the individual. It was very much about the individual and keeping the individual under control.
you could say that the pre-Christian West, like these Germanic tribes, were very individual centric, but I would argue quite the opposite. They were very societal centric in that warrior societies are usually socially centric, and that there wasn't a significant difference between the context of Germanic paganism and early Germanic Christianity in the migration period and the contemporary society that Muhammad was preaching in 6th and 7th century Arabia. They seem like almost they obviously have this idea of warriors earning individual glory in both, but also an idea of making yourself secondary to a tribe or a clan or a family. That these are not truly, either of them, fully individualistic, although they both have individualistic elements.
Well, nothing's going to be 100% individual, because then you don't have a community. And if you go 100% community, well, you don't have any individuals left.
I would argue that in many ways, the Islamic world was more defined by individuality than the West, because the development of these proto-kingdoms into nation states, these came about as a representation of society. France develops into a society. But even today in the Islamic world, identity isn't assigned communitarianly, but usually as the result of an individual, as the following of an individual leader. So
one of my tests is, what's the reaction to sharing a dissenting opinion? Are you allowed as an individual to hold a different opinion? As Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, the first place that humans were guaranteed by the government the right of consciousness, am I allowed to think and worship as I think best? And if I'm not, what is the penalty? And in Islam, to disagree, I see bringing capital punishment.
Well, that's an ideological framework around the interpretation of Islamic, an ideal of Islamic values, like a representation of Islamic values. But I lived in Morocco, in an Islamic society. I've lived in there almost 2 years, and publicly presenting dissenting opinions all the time. And people are also doing this. Moroccans are constantly, joking and criticizing aspects of religion. People think that
you're allowed to do that because you're a dhimmi.
That they don't criticize religion, they don't criticize the government.
You're allowed to do that because you're a dhimmi.
Is it actually
you're not a full human being there. You're a dhimmi. You're allowed to express a dissenting opinion.
Under the ideal of Islamic rulership, I'm not a dhimmi. I'm actually, a pagan. I'm a Wathanist. But because Islamic society has undergone the same sort of social developments in parallel to the West, they don't fulfill the values that we try to assume that they have because they are promoting this. But
depends where you're going.
Ideology that's not all too different from the West.
Depends where you're going in the Islamic world.
Yes,
I remember when the big uproar over, the Afghan, Afghan, they were using a UN-funded soccer stadium for their public executions. And the UN wanted them to stop, and they said, sure, we'll stop. Just build us a building for public executions then.
Here's the question. Is the concept of a public execution unique to the Islamic world, or is it one that has a long legacy until almost like just 100 years ago? Like the last public executions were less than 100 years ago in the West. So it's not as if this is a unique thing to the Islamic world, but the critique of it, the thing that Islam is particularly backwards because not universally among every Islamic society did they undergo the same developments as some Western societies did. I just find this as a way of
to me, the fact that you cannot leave the religion without members of the religion being commanded to kill you.
Well, and that the same as you have in Judaism. It's the letter of the scripture. It's the letter of the scripture, but is it actually practiced in reality? Maybe occasionally.
Where in Judaism does it say that if somebody...
In reality, it doesn't happen so much.
Yeah.
Where does it say in Judaism that if you decide to leave the religion, that the people in the religion have to kill you?
Well, Ariel, you can answer that one for me, because you know more about Judaism than me.
So it's something that's not practiced anymore. It was this idea that, let's see, apostasy in Judaism. Yeah. Here, let's see. Example. If your very own brother or your son or daughter or the wife you love or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, "Let us go and worship other gods, gods that neither you nor your father have known, gods of the people around you, whether near or far, from one end of the land to the other, do not yield to him or listen to him. Show him no pity. Do not spare him or shield him. You must certainly put him to death. Your hand must be the first in putting him to death, and then the hands of all the people. Stone him to death because he tried to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Then all Israel will hear and be afraid, and no one among you will do such an evil thing again."
Yeah, that first comes across as inherently contradictory because they start out saying that the person's only worshiping. Then they're saying they're trying to turn the person away from God to worship the other way.
Well, they're
And
trying
to
to
me,
justify retroactively why you need to, persecute this group of people before they do this, because they say that the inevitable consequence is if you allow apostasy, the apostates are going to continue proselytizing their apostasy.
right, and that's a sign of an inherently scared and inferior religion in my book, because if your religion was superior, you wouldn't be afraid of people going apostate.
No, I'm not arguing that this religion is inferior or superior. I'm just saying that this idea of apostasy being forbidden in religion is far from unique to the Islamic world.
I don't see how somebody can argue it. I don't see how anybody can argue against the case that if you're killing people because they go apostate, the religion isn't inherently insecure. Because
I agree with you completely, which is why I argue that these religions are fundamentally insecure. But I would also argue that it's not an issue unique to Islam, but an issue held in common among all Abrahamic religions.
I would expand that to religions in general. That's part of what I'm complaining about. The aspect of religion is they're always going to sacrifice that individual for the group. That's the essence of the scapegoat in Judaism. That's their official ceremony for, picking the group over the individual.
I would say it's become a kind of a cliche to say all religions are like this, and then you give the example of 3 Abrahamic religions as if there wasn't a multitude of religious practices throughout human history and even today that are strongly different from that. The practitioners of voodoo are not insecure in the same way. In fact, syncretism as a concept signifies the exact opposite, which is the norm in religion. The norm in religion is not exclusivity, but syncretism, which is the opposite of insecurity. It is we are open to influences from outside.
And to me, you're
millions and millions of people. Voodooism.
Yeah, to me, you're conflating 2 different things. Religion is unique to an individual group or people, and spirituality is the universal aspect. Religion is simply.
Well, here's the question: isn't that just an arbitrary division, though? Why are we
nothing arbitrary about nothing? Absolutely nothing arbitrary about that division.
Well, it just seems like the religious designations that you like, or you can endorse, these are spiritual. And this is a societal issue that I've noticed. And the religious and the spiritual traditions that are organized in ways that are objectionable, then they become religion. It almost becomes the religion cult distinction that Christians are guilty of endorsing. But the atheist
I agree 100%. There are narcissistic spiritualist people who do all sorts of spiritual gaslighting, and they use spirituality to propagate evil onto the world. But that's not what I'm talking about.
Well, I think the important thing in any debate is to define terms.
I know. I've defined my terms plenty. Here's my definition. Here's my definition. Spirituality is the relationship between the individual and the divine. Religion is the relationship between a group and the divine.
Okay, I see. So religion is just public spirituality, basically.
Right. And a religion is going to sacrifice any individual whose spirituality doesn't further the group's spirituality.
What if it's a religious tradition that, while there is a religious tradition, there's a spiritual tradition that intersects with it, and they don't usually find internal conflict? Right? To talk about the development of religious and spiritual practices as you define them in Ebla and in the kingdom of Yamhad, like Bronze Age Syria, they had exactly this distinction, but they were manifestations of the same, I guess, spiritual, metaphysical reality. So there would be the state gods and the state cult that people were expected to participate in. The royalty were expected to lead, but they would also have the concept of the head god and the personal altar. So maybe like the chief cult in Ebla would be the worship of Dagon and Ishara and all this and Hadad, but the king might have more of a personal relationship with Yaribol or Sin or some other deity that is his personal relationship. That is no longer, it's not the state ritual, it's the personal ritual.
Well, you have three. In the ancient world, I see four different levels of deity. You have your forces of nature deity, you have your state deity, you have your personal deity, and then you also have your tribal deity.
But they can also be all one in the same deity. So that
becomes the deity serving a role on each of the different levels.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's obviously different, values to what you may call spiritual and religious practices on different levels of society.
Yeah, and the way I see it working is any group of people develops by its, again, this is sort of call it a supernatural rule of a reality. Any group develops its own egregore for the group. And that's what that egregore ends up being one of those deities.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, many of these deities are just simply a representation of a national identity. Like there is the god Mer, who is the representation of Amorite nationality. It's a trans, state, trans city. Amorite nationality has this national god.
Right, as opposed to, say, Inanna, Ishtar, Isis, where that's basically an aspect of femininity.
Yeah, they're universal gods.
Yeah, that's an aspect of femininity, a function of nature, sort of.
Yeah, well, a Baal is this international, this universal god that can be worshipped in Egypt just as much as he's worshipped in Syria or in Anatolia, or just transformed into utterly different forms, like Thor and Zeus are essentially just transformations of Baal or Teshu, this thunder god, this raging thunder god as a force of nature, and it's sort of like a universal human concept.
No, definitely, and that's why, for me, religion, if you look at it as it's for what's best for the group. And sometimes that's where the scapegoat comes in. Sometimes that person may be perfectly right, but they're delivering painful truths that group doesn't want to hear.
Here's a question though: when does the needs of a group outweigh the needs of an individual?
That was at the end of Star Trek 2, wasn't it?
Yeah, I know. I was thinking of that exact concept, but the fact of the matter is, groups are invented. Groups are evolutionarily selected for as a meme, or even in eusocial animals as a biological adaptation, because it promotes the survival of the individual and the needs of the individual better than simple self-service. So obviously a society, a social organization that comes beyond the individual freedom is something extremely important.
Oh yeah, and that's where essentially that's what everybody has to decide, and that's what society has to deal with. What is the relationship between the individual and society?
Well,
The individual inherently has to emerge from that larger group Gestalt. But now that it's emerged, what does that individual do?
so first of all, I just want to say that's perfect because originally I was going for the episode or stream name, I was going to call it Two Gods, One Gestalt. So that's kind of funny. But the other thing I was going to say is that it's kind of actually emblematic of the story of Baal, because if you look at it, he's essentially the reason why. And again, like you could argue that it's not entirely voluntarily because his father, or not even necessarily his father, but El volunteers him as like a sacrifice to Mot. But essentially, it's to keep Mot from swallowing up all the life on Earth. And so, in that sense, Paul, realizes that. And again, I don't know whether it's a responsibility or whether it's like, because if it's a sacrifice, it implies that it's not a responsibility, not necessarily, but essentially the idea that that his death will lead to the preservation of life.
Mm-hmm.
But he's sacrificing his individuality to become one with all nature.
Actually, it's funny that you say that, but I'm trying. I would love to believe that, but I'm looking at the evidence, and I think it's quite the opposite. That Baal dying, the act of Baal dying, actually kills the world rather than saves it. His resurrection saves it. Kind of like in the story of Akkad's bow, the sin or the death of the hero is not a sacrifice for the good of society, but because he dies, because he makes the sacrifice, society suffers.
I mean, I disagree, because within the narrative, the idea is that, essentially that death was going to swallow up the whole world, and that Baal, because of how powerful he was, and also because he was almost like enough to satiate Mot, that he would. And like personally, this is where I think the idea of the substitution sacrifice, in terms of like where Christians get the idea that like Jesus was the last, sacrifice or whatever. The idea that his death was enough to atone for all the sins of the world. Whereas I think that rather than being about sin, it's literally about death, and it's kind of. Whereas like death was about it's almost like, imagine if a black hole is about to swallow up all of existence, and so someone who's so powerful, they're able to essentially go into the black hole, and they're able to get it to maybe not collapse but to stabilize, so that it constantly has a force, it's constantly drawing things in, but it's not like sucking things in to where they can't even experience life.
I mean, it's interesting to look at the metaphysical sort of effects of Baal's death, because it seems to me very much that Baal's death represents sterility itself, and his resurrection represents the return of life. It's the resurrection that saves rather than the death.
But I guess what I'm
is a big point of differentiation, because it's the sacrifice of Jesus that saves, not his resurrection. His resurrection is almost incidental, actually, to the story. The story is actually more meaningful if he doesn't resurrect, in my opinion.
So, kind of going on that, I think maybe it's almost like the difference between, what was it like? So sterility would be the death of Baal, but the lack of Baal dying, the lack of Baal sacrificing himself, it wouldn't be sterility. It would be like total death, if that makes any sense. Like whereas sterility is like the lack of ability for things to grow. I'm talking about not just things, not just like the crops dying, but like essentially everything dying.
Well, I'm wondering as to which, like, it's very tempting, from our Western perspective, on storytelling, that we have to assume that Baal has to die out of a moral obligation. It has to be a moral sacrifice.
Oh,
but the thing that I'm trying to get at is I don't see from the text a reason, a moral reason why Baal has to die.
No, I agree with that. But what I'm saying is, from a functional standpoint, death is going. It's not that the world is bad and so death is going to swallow it up, or that Baal is good and so he can stop it. It's simply about the fact that he represents growth and life and fertility, and Moab is, death and decay.
Yeah. Well, it isn't a heroic sacrifice. Baal doesn't die as a part of a heroic sacrifice. I may want him to die as a part of a heroic sacrifice, but the text doesn't show him making a heroic sacrifice. The text shows him dying because he has to die. It's nature to die. He resurrects because he has to resurrect. That's where the good comes from, which is the interesting thing.
Yeah, you're saying it's much more like the myth of Persephone.
Yes, it's very similar to the myth of Persephone. We really, really want there to be this moral sacrifice. We really want Baal to be this hero who goes down fighting. We want Baal to be this hero who overcomes death, like, grabbing the bull by its horns, as it were. But the death of Baal is just life. It is life to live and then die. But what's important isn't as much that Baal dies. It's how it is that he resurrects and how he resurrects.
Absolutely. The essence is I'm seeing what you're saying is Baal is very much part of circular time, underlying the fabric of reality.
Yes,
and I think part of what Ariel's doing, a good analogy for that one, to go even further west and non-Abrahamic, is sort of the Aztec and the Native American, 5 sons, where each son dies and then is reborn through the death. A god sacrifices its life in order to have the son reborn with that noble
This is exactly
god.
Right. It's a similar thing. It infers, rather than presenting a human-centric model of nature, a human-centric model of reality, it presents a nature-centric theology, a theology in line with nature. Baal doesn't resurrect because, he was so morally good. He resurrected because it is nature for death. He dies because it's nature for life to die in the summer in the Near East, and it's life for it to return in the fall with the rains and in the winter. So it's very much, rather than saying this is how it should be, therefore this is how it is. It's rather said this is how it is. So let's recognize this is how it is.
If I had to guess, my suspicion is that transition from the nature-centric to the more human-centric happened, right with the transition of the Bronze Age collapse. And prior to the Bronze Age collapse, you probably saw much more nature-centric sort of mythology, religions, and then it became much more anthropomorphic, human-centered afterwards.
I mean, like in a lot of Iron Age mythology, like the Bible stories are focused on human beings and human struggles. Same with Greek mythology. It's dealing with hubris. It's dealing with the individual sin of the hero with the tragic catharsis at the end. The Baal epic and other, of cosmological Near Eastern myths don't really read as stories of humans. They put them with personal names like they are humanoid, human-like. But this is as a way of representing cosmic nature, representing the nature of reality in a way that's understandable to human minds, basically. That's
that's an ancient tradition that all cultures did, where
Sure.
you encoded basically the aspects of reality and history together into the same document. You know, the Mahabharata is a classic example of that, with the
Yes.
whole wars and everything in there. And you have such strange things that jump out as the one woman who has 5 husbands, until you realize that what they're talking about is each of those husbands corresponds to a sense. And the woman's the body and the husbands are the 5 senses. And it's like, okay, clever writing, Peg.
It's the allegorical nature of mythology versus the literalist nature of mythology. Truth can't be literal, in my opinion. I think truth has to be allegorical at a certain level. When we're talking about science, when we're talking about philosophy, we are not describing reality. We're describing frames of looking at reality that are convenient for the way we engage with reality, for their reproducibility, for their practical effect. And I would argue, as representing Baal worship, representing Canaanite religion, it's not focused on so much the literal as it is focused on observing reality and creating a way of engaging with reality that's in tune to the nature of reality. That's the foundational truth of Cananism or Baalism, as I see it.
No, it makes sense, and I think that's true for most ancient religions, where so much of it was performative, and it was performative in the sense of getting the population to do those things which are needed to be done to survive. Again, like ancient Egypt with the flooding of the Nile and their festivals around that one. It's like you coach the religion and you build the religion around the needs of the people.
This is one of the reasons why I would argue that atheism is particularly dangerous, even if it is factually accurate. There are no anthropomorphic gods or supreme gods. Society needs a motivating factor to do the most basic things imaginable. For example, if I didn't have this kind of social and cultural motivation, I wouldn't have had to learn how to wash my hands or how to sneeze, in a tissue instead of all over my neighbor's face. It is a little bit of an exaggeration, but people need superstition on a certain level to accept reality. Reality requires superstition because reality isn't reality. Our senses are constantly lying to us. Our experience of reality is itself a simulation of our senses trying to create an approximation of reality that serves our purpose. And I think accepting a religion, accepting a religious tradition that on one hand is superstitious in the way that people need superstition, but on the other hand does not break people in a way that is unnatural. I think this is why religion, and specifically polytheistic religion, is so important and so needed in present society.
For me, I see it as a question of it's a question of purpose, and I have nothing wrong with somebody who wants to choose an ancient tradition. My rule is, as long as you're not going around and hurting other people needlessly, and I'm probably not going to give you a whole lot of grief.
Well, I hurt a lot of people needlessly, but not because of religion.
Well, again, I have an issue with needless harm. That's sort of my pet beef with society. But I think where it comes with is, from my experience, too many atheists unconsciously worship mammon.
Well, it's very much like people need to fill the void of religion in some way. You need to create this idol in some fashion. That's why I consider
they're worshiping it. They're worshiping something, whether consciously or unconsciously.
Speaking
and
of which,
atheists, they worship their own opinion, their own knowledge, And again, like I said, mammon, that's their way of judging, their standing in society. How much money do they have?
It's also like a hyper-individualist society, even if it's selfless, even if they're worshiping the idea of like giving to society. They think that there is a moral, they have, most atheists, I think they do believe in some sense of objective morality. Sam Harris certainly did. Hitchens. I mean, it's a very, very common accusation against the atheists that they're all morally relativists, but quite the opposite is the reality, that they are very morally stringent. And they're morally
close to that Kantian categorical imperative, which is not Christian.
And utilitarian, but they're always stuck on some level of moral absolutism, whether it's based on individual libertarianism or Kant or utilitarianism of some variety, or even pure virtue ethics. I see a lot of atheists who are superficially atheists, but they still believe fundamentally in the same moral system as the religion they came from, without any modification, essentially.
Guys,
apart from the disappearance of a deity.
I do need to get going like in like 2 minutes or whatever, actually I need to get going a while ago, but I think this is a good place to end it off. Though I was wondering, who was that supposed to be that you just last showed?
Oh, the one I showed? This guy? Richard Dawkins? Who's also a dude.
What is Shonda?
He's handsome, actually. I think part of the reason for his popularity is his charisma is not just that he's charismatic, but he's also very good looking. Silver Fox.
But yeah, I thought this would be a good place to end it off, and then.
Okay. Why?
So until next time, happy 420, happy Easter, happy hopefully the fascist government doesn't take over. Yeah, all those things.
It doesn't take over as if it wasn't already here for decades.
Sure. You know what I mean.
Oh, sorry.
Explicitly.
The fascist government doesn't get more fascist. I got it.
And hopefully they don't invent smell-o-vision, because then
What?
I remember smell-o-vision.
Yeah.
There's the wind in the 4 directions.
Yeah. So until next time.